Please subscribe to hear more Cryptid Tales. If you like the story you heard, give us a thumbs up and feel free to leave us a comment. If you'd like to hear your own cryptid encounter on Cryptid Tales, send us an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com. I was raised as an outdoorsman. I grew up learning skills like hunting and fishing, and preferred spending the majority of my time outside and in the woods over sitting in front of the TV and playing video games. A lot of people from small towns are brought up that way, so I really didn't know some people view it as different until I was older. It didn't take long for me to realize, after telling my story a few times, the one I'm about to tell you, that not everyone looks at you the same when you tell a story like this, especially people from the city. Now, me and my folks, along with my little brother, lived in town, but my aunt had a large piece of property on out towards the edge of town that was covered with woods, and that's where I did most of my hunting. Directly behind her house was a big pasture that she would lease out to some of the locals who owned livestock. After my uncle passed away, there was no way for her to take care of the place herself, so it was mutually beneficial for her to do so. Not only did cows love to graze out there, but so did deer. Early morning and late evenings, the deer would come out of the tree line on the back of the pasture and spend time grazing before returning back to wherever they were coming from off in the woods. Of course, as a kid, I had been all over that place, all the way back to the barbed wire fence that marks the boundary of my aunt's property. I had stirred up the deer quite a few times in those woods, but they always ran back over on the other side of that fence. It was like they knew I wasn't allowed to cross it, and with all the no trespassing signs stuck to it, I never dared try it. People out here tend to shoot first and ask questions later whenever it comes to trespassers. In the middle of my aunt's pasture is a cluster of trees. I don't know why they never got cut down, but over the years people would just cut and drive around them when they were baling the field. It looked kind of like an island out there in the middle of the pasture. On the back side of that island was a great big old oak tree, and that's the tree I always put my stand in when I hunted out there. The tree line was a little over 100 yards from the big oak tree across the pasture, so if deer came out to graze, they were well within shooting range, and usually made for a pretty easy target. Plus, it was my aunt's land, so I never had to worry about any other hunters coming along and screwing the place up for me, or harvesting the deer I was after that season. The reason I'm telling you all this is because for years and years, nothing was different. Nothing stuck out as odd. I never heard no crazy sounds, or found some sort of weird tracks I couldn't identify. The place was completely normal until that one year. The first strange thing that caught my attention happened when I was setting up my stand. It was a cold, cloudy day. Nobody was at the house, so I was the only one on the property. I had driven the four-wheeler back to the tree and started clearing out some overgrown brush around the base of the oak, when I just had this feeling like someone was watching me. It was all over me, and I just couldn't shake it. I stopped what I was doing and looked towards the woods. That's where it felt like it was coming from, but I didn't see anything. At first, I did my best to shrug it off, but I swear every time I turned my back, it felt like something was going to get me. Like I said, I never saw anything, but the feeling stayed with me the entire time I was there. I even yelled out a couple times and felt silly hearing my own voice echo through the trees. I got my stand up in record time and hightailed it back to the house on the four-wheeler. The first couple days of the season, nothing happened. I don't just mean nothing weird, I mean nothing at all. No deer, no signs of deer, no nothing. The third day was different. That night before, we had a front move through, and I thought for sure the wildlife would be stirring in the morning. As usual, I parked at my aunt's place and walked across the pasture to the island of trees and made my way into my stand. It was still dark by the time I got set up. Not unusual for a deer hunter, and nothing I hadn't done 100 times. I got settled in my stand and was just sitting there, halfway dozing off, waiting for the sun to rise, when I heard movement coming from the woods. It sounded like something taking big, slow steps, with the ground clutter snapping and crunching under each step. At first I thought it might be a cow tromping around through the woods, but all the cattle were gone off the property. It kept popping and snapping until it sounded like it was at the edge of the pasture straight across from me. The only light I had on me was a little red flashlight I used to help me get up into the stand, but I shined it towards the tree line. Couldn't see anything. Not even any eye shine from a critter. After shining my light at the woods, the noises and movement had stopped. I assumed whatever it was had made its way out of the area. Shortly after that, the sun started to rise, and I had enough light to see around me. There wasn't anything moving around out there, not even birds. The whole place felt still. Usually, birds start chirping down there when the sun starts casting light, but not that morning. It was late in the afternoon, and now the sun was on the other side of me starting to set. I thought the day was going to be another bust, and was trying to work my brain around it. It didn't make any sense. It was like the deer had quit coming to the pasture. That's when I saw them. 2 does walked out of the tree line, wiggling their ears and looking around the pasture. Soon their heads dropped as they started eating some of the grass at the edge of the woods, and a third bigger doe walked out from behind them into the pasture and started grazing. It wasn't long until the big fella made his appearance. It was the 8-pointer I had been looking for. I had passed him up last season to let him mature another year, but this season he was the one I was after. I put my scope on him as he walked out to graze in the pasture. It was him, all right. I'll spare you the details, but something spooked him and me right as I shot. It sounded like a large limb being snapped way back off in the woods. I got a good shot on him, but he didn't drop immediately. He stumbled and then got back up and tore off into the woods. I waited for a minute or two, watched the does go bounding off with their tails high in the air, and climbed down out of my stand. It was no problem picking up his blood trail, and I knew I probably wouldn't be tracking long. I followed it about another 100 yards or so off into the woods, and honestly, it was farther than I expected. I turned around and looked back towards the pasture and was surprised at how far I was. Then it seemed almost out of nowhere, the trail all but stopped. I started walking a circle and picked it up again, headed in a new direction. Only this time it was just a drop here and there. The thing that really got me was that some of the blood I found was on leaves that were above my waist. How in the heck did this thing bleed up there? It wasn't long before I had followed the trail to a point that made me feel sick to my stomach. There I was, standing at the barbed wire fence, looking at blood drops on the ground on the opposite side. No trespassing sign, wired to the top strand of the fence, just glared at me. I didn't want to trespass on private property, but I didn't want to leave a wounded deer out there either. It was already getting late, the sunlight would be gone soon, and there's no telling if I'd ever be able to find the trail again if they even gave me permission to go on their property. I didn't even know for sure who owned the land. I knew what I had to do, so I pulled apart 2 strands of the fence and climbed through to the other side. The blood trail led me to a spot about 50 yards from the fence row, but you couldn't see it from the fence due to the cover of the trees. The buck wasn't hard to spot. It was laying there in a lump on the ground, in the middle of a small clearing. What didn't make any sense was the condition it was in. The ground around the buck looked like it was cleared out, like the dead leaves and everything looked pushed back away from the deer. The head of the buck was twisted around and laid back against its spine. One of its hindquarters was just gone. When I say gone, I mean the entire leg was missing, like something had just ripped it off. Needless to say, the entire sight left me a bit freaked out. Honestly, I just sat there, kneeled down by the deer, trying to figure out what the heck happened. I thought maybe a human, but I mean, the neck was clearly broken, and that wasn't no knife cut where the leg was missing. I didn't know what to think. Between the sight of the deer and the confusion I had about what had happened, I hadn't really noticed that everything was still and completely quiet around me. No birds, no squirrels, not a leaf was moving. I probably wouldn't have even noticed it if it weren't for that sound in the back of my head. Drip, 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 drip. What was dripping? I spun around on my heels and fell over backwards. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There at the edge of this little clearing just a few feet from me was this giant covered in hair. You can call it Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or whatever you want. I'll call it a giant because that's what it was. It was just standing there staring at me, holding the deer leg down at its side. That dripping sound I was hearing was blood dripping from the torn off deer leg as it hit the dead leaves on the ground. I don't even know how long the thing had been standing there or if it had been there the entire time. I thought my heart was going to beat out of my chest as this thing just stared me down. Every now and then its shoulder or pec muscle would twitch, and each time I flinched thinking that was going to be it. I remembered my gun. I needed my gun. I wasn't going to let this thing tear off one of my legs. I slowly reached over for my rifle that I had laid on the ground next to the deer. I never took my eyes off the giant, though. I could see its nostrils flare wide open as I slowly pulled the rifle back over to me. This thing wasn't going to give up any ground. I don't know how, but somehow I managed to get back up to my feet, and I stood up. The giant didn't move an inch. It just kept staring at me. I slowly pulled the rifle up to waist level and pointed it towards the thing. I didn't want to shoot it. I was too scared and honestly didn't know if my little deer rifle was big enough to take this thing down. Now, I've never seen a big brown bear in person, but I've seen plenty of photos and videos of them, and this thing was every bit as big as one of those when standing on two legs. It was wide, too, built like a football player, with long hair covering most of its body. To be truthful, I wasn't paying much attention to the details of what this thing looked like. I was too busy trying to get out of there alive. I took a couple steps back around the deer and started slowly backing up towards the direction of the fence row. The giant didn't seem to care for that too much and snorted at me, which almost caused me to drop my gun out of fright. I stood there for what seemed like another 5 minutes before working up the courage to start moving again. I took another step back. When I started moving again, this thing let out what I can only describe as a cross between a roar and a man screaming. It startled me so bad I just held the rifle up and squeezed the trigger. I'm not sure where I hit it, but I know I hit it, and the giant screamed again, throwing the deer leg through the trees. I didn't know what else to do, so I just took off running. I ran as fast as I could and didn't look back. I could hear the thing screaming and thrashing around, but the more I ran, the farther away it sounded. It wasn't following me. I didn't stop until I got back to the truck at my aunt's house. I must have cut myself on the barbed wire fence, as my pants had a tear in them and there was a scratch on my leg that was bleeding pretty good. But I didn't even know I did it until then. I pulled my truck down to the edge of the pasture and turned my brights on, but didn't see anything. I left my stand in the oak tree, but still to this day have not climbed back up in it. I quit hunting my aunt's property altogether after that. It was years before I went out hunting again, and I haven't gone out alone since. I eventually worked up the nerve to talk to my aunt about it. I didn't want to, but I felt obligated. She said she believed me, but who knows. She did say that one year a fella she leased the pasture to ended up with a couple of newborn calves missing. They just wrote it off as coyotes at the time. although the owner wasn't too happy about it. I've told my story to a few people over the years, and most of the people there in the town I grew up in seemed to believe me. A friend of my cousin even said he saw one himself when he was fishing beneath the bridge one night. Said it threw mud at him from the opposite side of the creek. But people in the city, guys I work with, they just laugh at me and roll their eyes. Half the time they think I'm trying to pull their leg, but if they only knew what was out there.